Now, as the Russian aggression that was enabled from the West's inept energy policies takes its toll in all kinds of unanticipated arenas, like corporate executive leadership that we just covered, it brings us to the next topic to connect to, which is what is going on with EU energy policy as bureaucrats, the ones who created this entire global mess. They're now panicking to get a hold of a grid and energy network that is falling apart and destroying entire economies from the UK to France to Germany to Eastern Europe, all across the continent of Europe and the UK. And we know bureaucrats typically will run from accountability or avoid to admitting mistake, even if admitting a mistake is going to repair a current crisis. So instead of admitting a mea culpa on these energy policies and accords and climate regulations that need to be readdressed, and the things like natural gas, they need to be embraced instead of admitting that, what do we see occurring by the EU elite when it comes to their wrecked energy infrastructure and crumbling economies? Well, generally, it can be summed up as making things worse. The European Commission is thinking about fixing skyrocketing power prices by, yep, you guessed it, mandating decreased demand and capping prices for power. The things that failed for decades and all across the planet are once again being hailed as smart moves by the elite. Now, this gets interesting and ironic because when you cap power prices, you basically reduce what lower cost power in the portfolio receives. So under normal dispatch and power pools in Europe, all generation receives the price of the last unit to come on, or the most expensive. So more efficient sources of power make the most margins, and it's the same way for commodity markets for materials that you typically see. Now, these expert regulators, they want to cap the price for non-natural gas forms of power generation, which will lower the blended price of power, but it will make things like wind and solar unprofitable. And therein lies the upcoming freakout of the left, the environmental movement, and bureaucrats all over Europe. If you want to have the state intervene and lower or cap power prices for consumers, then it's going to come out of not Putin's pocket, but instead out of those heavily subsidized wind and solar farms all over Europe. And then that means there won't be those returns for those multi-billion euro corporations that threw capital at the projects because of the subsidy and the tax credits and the protected markets and the rent seeking. Ironic, don't you think? But, the regulators don't stop there with the ridiculous measures that are battling one another. There's also the thought that the state should start paying industrial or commercial users of power to not use the power by basically shutting down. So a lobbyist for European utilities, not the most dynamic or efficient of industries, and one that relies entirely on state support and protection, mind you, the lobbyist said that this reducing of power demand is no regret. Yeah, no regret. Except for collapsing GDP and shuttering economies and driving up unemployment and stoking inflation further as supply of goods are throttled from those closures. Today, the EU bureaucrat is engaged in an expensive game of spy versus spy. Remember that cartoon? Except it's intervention versus intervention in this case. Regulations were set to feed subsidy to wind and solar and hurt domestic natural gas in Europe. That enabled Putin, with his gifted energy leverage on the geopolitical stage, that set the stage for invasion and for energy insecurity and for inflation and for the power grid going bonkers on prices. So the bureaucrat sets new regs and intervention to fight the old regs and intervention, cap power prices, reduce them by lowering the price received by wind and solar, since you can't make Putin lower the price of natural gas, and thus natural gas-fired power generation, and then watch the subsidy seeker throw fits. Or force demand cutoffs to industrial or commercial or consumer users and observe a crumbling economy and GDP. Like the cartoon Spy versus Spy, and intervention versus intervention, everyone ends up a loser. The Ministry and Minister of Industry and Trade for the Czech Republic had a scary and at the same time comical quote on Twitter. He said, "We must fix the energy market. We must fix the energy market." My goodness, isn't it obvious the government already fixed things enough when they created the current mess? And another interesting side note to this state's continued bungling of making crises and then worsening them is how the press and the media presents them. Lots of headlines about tweaks. That's the term I saw in these headlines, a tweak to energy pricing, and plans that are, the tagline I keep hearing is under consideration. Come on. These are far from tweaks. It's outright state intervention and control of a fundamental market that's failed, and now we see the perpetrators doubling down with a heavy-handed ineptitude. Like the great Thomas Sowell says, there are no silver bullets in things like markets, only trade-offs. And now the EU is learning it needs to pick between climate goals that killed domestic natural gas on the continent, a strong and reliable grid, insane power prices and inflation brought on by energy insecurity, and subsidized wind and solar and their state-gifted margins in a controlled power market. All this goes to show is that state intervention is typically not good for consumers or reliability or GDP or national security, and the cure of more state intervention will only make the symptoms worse. Function demands a free market and a thriving natural gas market. Dysfunction, it's a sure thing with heavy-handed state intervention as we have and we will continue to see.